Marcus Chen was 34 years old, a security guard at Sacred Heart Hospital, a sprawling complex of beige buildings that honestly looked more like a prison than a place of healing in suburban Ohio. His life followed the same routine each night. Arrive at 10 p.m., check in with the day shift supervisor, walk the predetermined routes every 2 hours, and watch the monitors that showed empty hallways and sleeping patients. God, he hated those monitors sometimes. The flickering blue light made him feel like he was watching his own life drain away, pixel by pixel. He lived alone in a studio apartment, 6 blocks from the hospital, his only company the police scanner that crackled softly in the corner. And let's be honest, the occasional bottle of cheap wine when the loneliness got too loud. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 5, worked themselves to exhaustion running a small restaurant that failed when he was 22, leaving him with nothing but their work ethic and a profound understanding of what it meant to be invisible, which was pretty much his specialty at this point. His girlfriend Sarah had left 3 months ago, tired of his silences, tired of competing with ghosts she couldn't see, tired of loving someone who seemed to save all his energy for strangers. "You care more about random people than you do about me," she'd screamed during their last fight. And, hell, maybe she was right. Maybe that was the problem with him. Maybe that was why he was walking empty hospital corridors at 2 a.m. instead of sleeping next to someone who loved him. On a Wednesday in late September, Marcus first noticed the girl. Actually, that's not true. He'd probably seen her before, but hadn't really seen her. You know how it is when you're sleepwalking through your own life until something snaps you awake. She couldn't have been older than 17, thin in the way that made you think, Christ, when did she last eat a real meal? Her hospital ID badge hung from a lanyard around her neck, marking her as a volunteer, but she moved through the corridors like she was trying not to leave footprints. She appeared every night, around 11 p.m., always carrying a small backpack that looked like it held everything she owned in the world, and a thermos that seemed too big for her tiny hands. She would sit in the family waiting area outside the ICU, her legs curled beneath her like a cat trying to take up as little space as possible, reading the same paperback novel over and over. And Marcus found himself wondering what kind of book you read when you're trying to disappear. The first time Marcus spoke to her was to ask if she needed anything. Stupid question, really, because obviously she needed a lot of things, but sometimes you have to start somewhere. She looked up with eyes that, Jesus Christ, held too much knowledge for someone so young, like she'd seen things that would give him nightmares. Shook her head and returned to her book. The second night, the same. The third night she wasn't there, and Marcus surprised himself by actually giving a damn. By the fourth night, Marcus had begun to worry, which was weird because he'd trained himself not to get attached to the rotating cast of worried families and late-night visitors. After Sarah left, he'd decided feelings were overrated, but something about this girl's stillness, the way she sat like she was holding vigil for the entire world, made him check the waiting area twice during his rounds, like some kind of mother hen. When she returned on the 5th night, Marcus brought her a cup of coffee from the nurse's station. "Oh, I can't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't work here, not really." And there it was, that shame. He recognized the "I don't deserve anything good" voice that he knew too well from his own mirror. Marcus set the cup down anyway. "Hospital policy, everyone who stays past midnight gets coffee," he lied easily, because sometimes lying is kinder than truth. It's a safety thing, keeps people alert. Complete bullshit, but it sounded official enough. The girl's eyes flickered with something that might have been gratitude or suspicion, hard to tell when someone's been burned too many times. But she accepted the cup, wrapping her hands around its warmth like it was the first kindness she'd felt in months. Which maybe it was. It became their unspoken ritual. Each night, Marcus would bring coffee, sometimes a package of crackers from the vending machine that probably cost more than her last meal, sometimes a sandwich from the cafeteria that was closing anyway. "Waste not, want not," he would say. Though really he was buying the food with his own money and lying about it because the truth would have made her feel like charity. The girl never asked for anything, never offered her name, but she began to nod when he approached her chair, began to murmur, "Thank you," in a voice that carried the weight of someone who rarely had reason to be grateful. And Marcus started to look forward to that tiny moment of human connection in the middle of another endless night shift. Look, he wasn't stupid. He knew this was probably against hospital policy, probably against common sense, probably against everything they'd taught him in security training. But Marcus had learned the hard way that sometimes the rules are wrong, and sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that gets you in trouble. Marcus learned her patterns. She arrived at 11 p.m. precisely, stayed until 4 a.m., reading the same book over and over, drinking the coffee like she was trying to make it last forever because maybe it was the only warm thing in her day. When the first nurses began to arrive for the morning shift, she would disappear through the emergency exit that led to the parking garage, like smoke, like she was never there at all. "Who's the kid you keep feeding, Linda?" a nurse who worked the night shift asked one week into their routine, and Marcus felt his defenses go up because here we go. "Never seen her with any patience, Linda," she continued, and there was that tone, the one that meant trouble was coming. "Don't know," Marcus admitted, "but she's here every night. Something's not right about it," which was the understatement of the century. But what was he supposed to say? "She looks like she's running from something, and I know that look because I've been running from things my whole life." Carol, who managed the volunteer program, cornered Marcus in the break room after the second week, and he knew from her expression that his little coffee arrangement was about to become a big problem. "You're enabling something," she said, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who had seen good intentions create dependencies. "She's not even a real volunteer. Her paperwork expired months ago." And there it was, the bureaucracy that valued forms over human beings. Marcus didn't argue. Hell, what was the point? He simply shrugged and said, "She's not hurting anyone," which was true, but also missing the point because Carol wasn't worried about hurt. She was worried about liability, about lawsuits, about all the things that kept administrators awake at night. It was the most personal information he'd shared with his coworkers in the 2 years he'd worked at Sacred Heart, mostly because he'd learned that caring too much made people uncomfortable, and Marcus was already uncomfortable enough for everyone. The girl never volunteered her story, and Marcus never asked, because honestly, he was afraid of the answer. Something in her posture, the way she positioned herself to see all entrances, like she was expecting trouble, the careful way she folded her jacket to use as a pillow, told him that questions would only drive her away, and he'd already lost too many people. Instead, he made sure the coffee stayed warm, that the waiting area remained quiet, that she had a place where she could exist without explanation for 5 hours each night. And if that made him some kind of enabler, well, at least he was enabling survival. Sometimes, when the hospital was particularly quiet, usually around 3 a.m., when even the emergency department slowed down, and the girl was absorbed in her book, Marcus would allow himself to wonder. Stupid things, really. Was she homeless? Probably. Did she have family? Doubtful. Why did she choose this place to spend her nights? Because hospitals are warm and open all night, and security guards are trained to be invisible. And why did exhaustion seem like such a familiar companion to her? Because Marcus recognized that bone-deep tiredness that came from constantly looking over your shoulder, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, constantly surviving instead of living. But he pushed the thoughts away, because in his experience, kindness with conditions wasn't kindness at all. It was just another form of control. And this girl had probably had enough people trying to control her life. So he continued their silent arrangement, watching as the girl's shoulders gradually relaxed from their defensive hunch, as her eyes began to meet his for a moment longer each time he brought her coffee. And Jesus, that was something, wasn't it? That tiny moment of trust, like watching a feral cat decide you might not be dangerous after all. That small change, the way she would sometimes smile slightly when he approached, not a real smile, but the ghost of one, was enough to convince Marcus that whatever he was doing, however small it might be, mattered. And in a life that felt increasingly meaningless, mattering was everything. By the 6th week, others had noticed his routine with the girl, because apparently, even in a hospital full of people dying and being born, someone bringing coffee to a teenager was newsworthy. Most said nothing, but some couldn't resist commenting, their observations laced with the particular judgment of those who had forgotten what it meant to need shelter. Or maybe they'd never needed it at all. Some people are born lucky and never question why. "Playing social worker on company time?" asked Dr. Peterson, a surgeon who often worked late, his tone suggesting he found the entire arrangement unprofessional. And Marcus wanted to ask when exactly caring about people had become unprofessional, but Peterson was the kind of man who performed miracles in the operating room and probably thought that gave him the right to judge everyone else's definition of helping. "Kids these days think they can just camp out anywhere," said another staff member, someone from administration whose name Marcus had never bothered to learn. "Times must be changing. In my day, hospitals were for patients, not runaways." And Marcus bit his tongue because what he wanted to say was, in your day, a lot of people just died quietly, and we called it character. Marcus heard these comments, but let them pass through him like water through a sieve. Because he'd learned early that defending kindness often made critics more vocal, made them think they'd found your weakness. And honestly, he was tired of explaining why basic human decency shouldn't require an explanation. However, Janet, the night shift supervisor, wasn't so easily ignored. She called Marcus into her small office behind the security desk one morning, her expression serious beneath her perpetually tired eyes. And Marcus knew this was it. The end of coffee and quiet kindness, the return to walking empty hallways and pretending not to see the people who needed help. "I've been watching you with that girl," she said, fingers drumming against the metal desk like a countdown to unemployment. "Can't have unauthorized persons using the hospital as a hotel. It's a liability issue and sets a precedent." And there it was, liability, the word that killed more kindness than cruelty ever could. Marcus twisted his radio in his hands. "I understand," which was bullshit, because he didn't understand how helping someone became a liability, how offering coffee became a legal problem, how treating a scared kid like a human being somehow endangered a hospital. "She's not causing any problems," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak they sounded. Janet's eyebrows rose. "That's not the point. We have protocols for a reason. It's my responsibility." And Marcus felt something quiet but firm rise in his voice. "She stays in the public areas, never bothers patients or staff, just reads her book." And somehow, in that moment, he realized he was willing to lose this job over a girl whose name he didn't even know. After a long moment that felt like an hour, Janet sighed. "Fine, but if there are any complaints or if she causes any disruption, this stops immediately. Understood?" Marcus nodded, relief washing over him like cold water, because he'd anticipated being written up, perhaps even losing his job. But this compromise, this fragile permission to continue caring, he could live with. Each night he set aside a small portion of his break time to check on the girl, time that might have been spent catching up on sleep or calling his sister in California or doing any of the things that normal people did during breaks. But Marcus had stopped being normal the day Sarah walked out, and maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. On a particularly cold Thursday in November, the girl didn't show up. Marcus found himself checking the waiting area every 30 minutes like some kind of worried parent, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach, the kind of dread that starts small and grows until it's eating you alive. He prepared a cup of coffee anyway, leaving it on the table where she usually sat just in case, because hope dies hard even when you know better. "Waste of resources," Carol muttered as she passed, shaking her head like Marcus was personally responsible for the hospital's budget problems. and he wanted to tell her that caring about people wasn't a waste. It was the whole goddamn point. But Carol had never sat alone in a waiting room at 3 a.m., so what would she know? By morning, the untouched coffee had grown cold, a silent reminder of absence, and Marcus poured it down the drain, feeling like he was pouring away something more important than caffeine. The girl didn't appear the next night either, or the next. A week passed with no sign of her, and Marcus began to wonder if Carol had been right all along. Had she simply moved on, found something better somewhere else? Some other warm place with some other sucker willing to buy her coffee? And he hated himself for thinking it. Because when had he become so cynical? The thought left him with a hollow ache he couldn't quite explain. Because he'd known nothing about her, not her name, not her story, whether she was safe or scared or hungry. But her absence felt significant, like a small light had been extinguished, and the world was dimmer for it.
"Told you so," Carol said on the 10th day of her absence, not unkindly, but with the assurance of someone whose cynicism had been validated once again. "They never stay once they find something better." And Marcus wanted to ask what exactly Carol thought was better than a cup of coffee in a safe place to sit, but he kept his mouth shut, because arguing with Carol was like arguing with the weather, pointless and exhausting. During this period, Marcus noticed a staff member taking photos of the empty waiting area, which seemed weird, but then again, people photographed everything these days, so maybe it wasn't that strange. The next day, he discovered why. Someone had posted the images on social media with a sarcastic caption, "Sacred Heart now providing free hotel services, complete with room service apparently." And the comments, Jesus, the comments were harsh. "Liability nightmare waiting to happen," said one. "That guard needs to learn boundaries," said another. "Enabling homelessness isn't helping anyone." And Marcus stared at his phone screen, wondering when compassion had become a character flaw. Marcus had never considered himself particularly sensitive to other people's opinions, mostly because other people's opinions rarely paid his rent. But the cruelty of these comments stung like salt in a cut he didn't know he had. That night, alone in his apartment, he questioned his actions for the first time. Was he wrong to help someone without knowing their circumstances? Was he projecting his own experiences, his own need to matter onto a situation he didn't understand? Was he really helping or just making himself feel better about his own failures? Seeking comfort, he opened a small metal box where he kept his most precious possessions, the things that reminded him why he was still here. Inside lay a faded photograph of his parents, standing in front of their restaurant, his mother's hand resting on his father's shoulder, both smiling despite the exhaustion in their eyes, that bone-deep tiredness that came from working 18-hour days and still barely making ends meet. Beside it was a letter from his father, written in careful English during Marcus's first year of college, back when Marcus still believed in things like purpose and meaning. "We work hard so you can choose kindness," the letter read. And Marcus could hear his father's voice in the words, hear the accent that never quite faded, the hope that somehow America would be different for his son. "In America, we learn that helping others is not weakness, it is strength. When someone needs shelter, you give shelter. When someone needs food, you give food. You ask questions later, because questions can wait, but hunger cannot." Marcus traced his finger over his father's handwriting, faded now from years of handling, and suddenly he felt that familiar clarity washing over him. The same feeling he'd had as a kid when his father would explain something complicated and make it simple. He didn't need to know the girl's name or story to recognize someone who needed a safe place to exist. And existence without safety was a form of hunger that asked for shelter, not explanations. His father had been right. Questions could wait. Nobody knew why she came, nobody remembered who helped. But each night, someone wasn't alone. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. If you still believe small acts can create sanctuary, please type hope. On the morning of the girl's 23rd absence, Marcus arrived at the hospital with diminished expectations because hope was exhausting and he was tired of being disappointed. The habit of checking the waiting area at 11 p.m. remained, but the sharp worry had dulled to quiet resignation, like a bruise that stops hurting but never quite heals. Still, he prepared a cup of coffee just in case, because habits die hard and hope dies harder, and left it on her usual table like an offering to a ghost. On 6:47 a.m., everything changed, and when I say everything, I mean everything. The first sign was the sudden activity in the normally quiet morning corridor. Marcus, monitoring the security cameras, glanced up to see 3 unmarked cars with government plates pulling into the hospital's main entrance, and his first thought was bomb threat. His second thought was, shit, what now? They moved with coordinated precision, the kind of choreographed efficiency that screamed federal agents, forming a line near the emergency department entrance like they were preparing for war, or at least a very serious conversation. From the lead car stepped a woman whose bearing commanded attention before her credentials did, and Marcus knew immediately that whatever was happening was about to change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. Tall, with a composed demeanor of someone accustomed to delivering news that altered people's worlds, she wore a dark suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and carrying herself with the authority of someone who had seen things that would break normal people. She was flanked by 2 younger agents, both scanning the hospital entrance with practiced awareness, like they were expecting trouble, or maybe just used to finding it everywhere they went. The receptionist at the information desk straightened nervously as they approached, because federal agents had that effect on people, made you question whether you'd accidentally committed a crime just by existing. "We're looking for the night security guard," the woman said, her voice carrying across the lobby with the kind of authority that made everyone stop talking. "A man named Marcus. Chen?" And there it was, his name, spoken by a federal agent at 6:47 in the morning, which was either very good news or very bad news, and Marcus had lived long enough to know which one was more likely. Marcus emerged from behind the security desk, his heart rate quickening despite having done nothing wrong, well, nothing illegal anyway, though apparently buying coffee for scared teenagers was suspicious behavior these days. "I'm Marcus," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, trying to sound like someone who never broken a rule in his life, instead of someone who had spent weeks violating hospital policy for the sake of basic human decency. The woman's expression softened slightly, which was either reassuring or terrifying. "Mr. Chen, I'm Agent Sarah Winters, FBI." She reached into her jacket and withdrew a leather folder containing official documents, and Marcus's first thought was, "This is it, I'm going to jail for giving away coffee." "I'm here because of someone you've been helping," she continued. "Someone who couldn't ask for help herself." And the world tilted. "The girl?" he said, though it came out more as a question than a statement because his brain was trying to process federal agents and missing teenagers and coffee cups, and suddenly nothing made sense anymore. Agent Winters nodded. "Emma Rodriguez. She's been missing for 4 months. Her family reported her as a runaway, but we've been tracking her part of a larger investigation into human trafficking." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow because human trafficking was something that happened to other people, in other places, not to quiet girls reading books in hospital waiting rooms. Human trafficking? He repeated, the phrase foreign on his tongue like he was learning a new language that he didn't want to speak. "Emma escaped from a trafficking ring in Cleveland," Agent Winters explained, and Marcus felt the floor shift beneath him because Cleveland was 2 hours away, and suddenly, the girl's watchfulness, her fear, her need to see all exits made terrible sense. She's been moving between safe spaces, trying to stay invisible while we built our case against her captors. What we didn't know was where she'd been spending her nights, until yesterday when she finally felt safe enough to contact us. The pieces began falling into place for Marcus like a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. The careful way she entered and exited the hospital, the way she positioned herself to see all entrances, the exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, the book she read over and over like a talisman against terror, the way she flinched when anyone approached too quickly. Jesus Christ, she was running for her life, and he'd been giving her coffee like that could fix anything. She told us about the security guard who brought her coffee every night. Agent Winters continued, who never asked questions, never made her feel like she had to explain herself. She said you were the first person in months who treated her like a human being instead of a problem to be solved. A collective intake of breath seemed to come from the small crowd of early morning staff who had gathered to watch the exchange, because apparently federal agents were more interesting than morning coffee. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he imagined Emma, now with a name, with a story, trying to survive while carrying trauma he couldn't begin to understand. "Yesterday, we arrested 7 members of the trafficking ring," Agent Winters said, her voice professional but not without warmth. And Marcus thought about Emma sitting in that waiting room reading her book while monsters were hunting for her. Emma's testimony was crucial to breaking the case, but she told us she might never have found the courage to come forward if not for those quiet moments in your hospital. She said you showed her that kindness still existed in the world, that not everyone wanted something from her. Marcus accepted a business card with trembling hands, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a blanket. Because how do you process the fact that coffee and silence had somehow helped bring down criminals?
The agent's voice seemed to come from far away as she continued. "What you did, Mr. Chen, what you did for a girl who couldn't tell you why she needed help. That kind of instinctive compassion is what allowed us to save not just Emma, but potentially dozens of other victims." The hospital had fallen completely silent. Even those who had criticized Marcus stood motionless, faces reflecting shock and shame. Because suddenly, buying coffee for a scared kid didn't seem like such a policy violation. Agent Winters extended her hand for a formal handshake. "On behalf of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and more importantly, on behalf of Emma and her family, thank you. Your simple act of providing coffee and safety without questions created the foundation of trust that ultimately brought down a criminal organization." Marcus stood frozen, overwhelmed by the knowledge that his quiet routine had been part of something so much larger than he could have imagined. "I didn't know," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just thought she needed a safe place to sit." Agent Winters nodded, and there was something like understanding in her eyes. "Sometimes that's everything, Mr. Chen. Sometimes providing sanctuary without asking why someone needs it is the most powerful thing you can do." And as if summoned by her words, Emma appeared at the hospital entrance. She looked different now, no longer carrying the weight of someone who belonged nowhere, no longer glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, no longer moving like she was trying not to leave footprints. She was flanked by what were clearly family members and social workers, people who looked like they gave a damn about her well-being, people who had probably been searching for her while Marcus was pouring coffee. Her eyes found Marcus across the lobby, and she raised her hand in a small wave before mouthing the words, "Thank you." And Marcus felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away since Sarah left. Marcus, the quiet security guard who had lived nearly invisibly for years, stood in the center of it all, holding a business card that represented the conclusion of a story he never knew he was part of. A man whose small nightly kindness had preserved not just a girl's safety, but potentially saved countless others from unimaginable suffering. And all he'd done was bring coffee. The month following Agent Winters' visit transformed Sacred Heart Hospital in ways no one could have predicted. The story spread through the medical community like wildfire, jumping from internal memos to professional journals to national news, because apparently helping people was newsworthy when it involved federal agents and happy endings. The same social media post that had mocked Marcus's unauthorized charity now shared the true story, gathering thousands of shares and comments of support. "Thank you for showing us what real security looks like." And "My daughter was trafficked. Your kindness gives families like ours hope." Staff members began seeking Marcus out specifically, which was weird because for 2 years he'd been practically invisible, leaving notes of appreciation and requesting his advice on suspicious behavior, like he was some kind of expert instead of a guy who'd stumbled into doing the right thing. Regular visitors to the hospital began to notice and report concerning situations because suddenly everyone was paying attention to the scared kids in waiting rooms, the people who didn't quite belong, the ones who looked like they were running from something. 2 weeks after the arrests, Marcus received a manila envelope with no return address, which immediately made him think of anthrax or letter bombs, because his brain still couldn't quite process that he was the kind of person who received thank you notes from federal investigations. Inside was a handwritten letter on lined paper, the careful handwriting of someone still learning to trust. Dear Marcus, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm the girl who used to read in the waiting area. And Marcus almost laughed because remember her? Hell, he'd been mourning her absence for weeks. You probably saved my life, but I want you to know you definitely saved my soul. When everything felt hopeless, when I thought I was invisible and worthless, you saw me as a person worth helping. You didn't ask me to prove I deserved kindness, you just gave it. The FBI agents told me that traffickers rely on victims feeling invisible, believing no one cares enough to notice them. But you noticed me every single night. You made me remember I was human, not just a thing to be used. Marcus had to stop reading for a minute because his eyes were doing that thing where they got all blurry, and he wasn't crying, he was just tired. Really tired. I'm in school now, learning to be a social worker. I want to help other girls like me find their way back to believing in kindness. Your friend, Emma. P.S. I finally finished that book I was reading over and over. It was about a girl who found her way home. Marcus framed the letter and placed it on his desk at the security station. Not prominently, not for show, but as a reminder for why paying attention matters. Why seeing people matters. Why sometimes the smallest gestures echo the loudest. When people asked about it, he would simply say, just a thank you note from someone who needed to know she wasn't invisible. And leave it at that, because some stories were too precious to cheapen with explanations. Word of the hospital's connection to the trafficking case spread throughout law enforcement communities. Agents and officers began making informal visits, often sharing information about warning signs and suspicious activity. These conversations found their place in the hospital's monthly safety meetings, a growing network of awareness that extended far beyond Sacred Heart because it turned out that paying attention was contagious. 3 months after Agent Winter's visit, a training seminar was held at the hospital about recognizing signs of human trafficking. A 12-year-old girl attending with her mother who worked in billing studied Marcus as he spoke to the group about the importance of noticing without judging. Are you proud of what you did? She asked during the question period. And Marcus considered this carefully because pride was a complicated thing. I'm proud that I paid attention, he said finally. But I'm not proud that it took a federal investigation for people to understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is offer someone a place to sit without asking them to explain why they need it. The girl's mother added quietly after the session, that's the lesson, isn't it? That we never know what someone is carrying. And Marcus nodded because that was exactly the lesson, though it had taken him 34 years and a scared teenager to learn it. As spring arrived, the hospital established a new protocol for overnight visitors, creating comfortable spaces for those who needed to stay and training staff to recognize signs of distress or trafficking. The program was quietly funded by donations from families who had heard Emma's story. During the dedication ceremony, Marcus was asked to speak, but he declined, instead suggesting that the focus should remain on creating safe spaces, not celebrating the people who provide them, because the moment you start congratulating yourself for basic human decency, you've missed the point entirely. On a quiet Tuesday morning, almost exactly a year after Emma had first appeared in the waiting area, Marcus arrived for his shift to find something small and metallic on his desk. A challenge coin, the kind given by federal agencies to recognize extraordinary service, lay beside his coffee cup like a promise. One side bore the FBI seal, the other had been custom engraved. With hope, there is always light. Marcus looked around the empty security office, searching for whoever might have left it. Finding no one, he stepped into the hallway, scanning the corridor like he was looking for ghosts. As the morning shift arrived, nurses chatting softly about their patients and families beginning another day of waiting, he slipped the coin into his pocket, its weight a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of service happen in the spaces between official duties. That evening, as Marcus prepared for another night of rounds, he noticed a new sign posted near the information desk. Simple but clear, it read, "If you need a safe place to wait, we're here. No questions, no time limits." When he asked Janet about it, she shrugged with studied casualness. New policy, figured it was time. And Marcus smiled, understanding the unspoken acknowledgement in her gesture. No grand announcements, no publicity, just a quiet commitment to see the need for sanctuary in others and respond with what matters most. Safety without conditions, shelter without interrogation, coffee without explanations. As he began his first round of the night, the challenge coin a solid presence in his pocket, Marcus thought about Emma, now building a new life with her family, carrying the knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, kindness exists in unexpected places. Not everyone who helps needs recognition. Some people just need to know that tonight someone isn't alone, and that alone is enough to change everything. You might forget this story in a few days, but if nobody retells it, the quiet heroes will remain invisible forever. Subscribe to stories where ordinary people become extraordinary simply by choosing to notice.